3 years of what seems to be increasing devastating weather for the province?
Thank you very much, and good evening. So, weather-wise, the 3 different, flooding incidences that we've had, that you've mentioned, are attributed to different weather systems. The current one, of course, is a low cut-off system that is bringing in the weather, the rainfall, and of course, it's being worsened by the warm, air system coming in from the Indian Ocean, particularly for the coastal areas in KZN. Previously, the flooding has been associated with tropical cyclones that have been also coming through from the Indian Ocean. So the weather systems responsible for the different flooding events vary, but what you are speaking to is the trend in flooding and the frequency and intensity of these floods, and that is something worth noting. And I think we've been talking about climate change as though it is something that is yet to happen, whereas we should be talking of it as something that is currently underway. And, we always say climate change will bring, but the essence of it is that, it is bringing with it these weather extremes that we are witnessing, flash flood events, extreme hot temperatures, shifts in seasonality from what we've already known. So we are experiencing, that phenomenon as we are living.
It's interesting because just looking again at the statement from the South African Weather Service, there's a specific question there that they answer about could this rain system be attributed to global warming and climate change? And effectively they go on to say that, well, we can't say yes due to one event or due to several events just over a period of years or even a decade. But what they can say is that the general changing nature of the climate and global warming is going to result in all forms of severe and extreme weather, and part of what we are seeing is not exempt from that.
So that would be the preferred technical answer, because we cannot attribute a single event to climate change. We can attribute it to weather, which is the state of the climate at a particular given time, at a particular place. Climate would then be meaning long term. We'd be looking at 30 years to say over a 30-year period, what has happened? Then we can say, okay, we can say, yes, it is climate change. But as they say, we cannot exempt this from that phenomenon.
Professor Chipungu, let me come to you. Now more than ever, the question around town planning becomes even more pertinent, because when we look at these floods, it is particularly those houses that have been built in low-lying areas that become overwhelmed. I mean, an area like Ladysmith has just been through the worst period over the last couple of years, because we've seen every time that we have a state of this kind of disaster, it is always involved, and it doesn't escape perhaps the heavy rains and the flooding.
It's, thank you very much, and good evening to all your listeners. I think you are right. The issue of planning comes to question, and of course, very often it is also been attributed as one factor which leads towards at least flooding in most instances. But we also have to look at the events happening across the globe. And South Africa is not exempted to that. And this is a situation where we are dealing with a massive movement of people from different areas to urban areas. And this put a lot of stress on the infrastructure. And if you look at Durban specific, even the Ladysmith, we have a lot of people who've been moving to urban areas. And when they get to urban areas, obviously they will need a place to stay. And from town planning perspective, we often leave open spaces within our cities, and these are the areas where they find it conducive to live in because they're close to their workplace. But we leave those places sometimes for a number of reasons, and one, just to give an example, is because most of those areas, they're not livable, they're not meant for residential purposes, and because of the reasons that we are talking about, which is to do with the flood plain or flooding areas. So those are the issues that we are dealing with. If people, they are going to stay in the low-lying areas, like you're saying, which are highly sensitive to flooding, obviously this will be the impact. They will be hit the hardest when the climate change takes its own course. And also the issues around the informal settlement, which are mushrooming, especially in Durban, is also contributing towards flooding significantly, because we do have evidence where you find that most of this informal settlement produce a lot of solid waste. And these solid waste are actually not being collected effectively across all this informal settlement. Now, if we all agree that we have informal settlement which are mushrooming on almost every month or so, where is the waste going if we are not collecting them? And these are the wastes which will find themselves into our drainage system. And of course, it's very easy to target a solid collection, maybe areas like high-income areas. But when flooding hits, it hits all of us, including the high-income areas. And it's important that we also observe those issues around high urbanization, which is not presented in the history, but also which is not accompanied by infrastructure expansion and many other issues which are attributed to that.
One of the things that this triggers, of course, is a conversation around how to future-proof infrastructure, especially in an area like KZN, if in fact this is the kind of weather patterns that that province is going to be exposed to over the years. So from a town planning perspective, what are the conversations that need to be happening right now to ensure that, you know, that officials are better prepared and that the infrastructure itself is also better prepared? Because we've had some of the key roads in that province that have been completely submerged underwater. As Sanral describes it, they say that those roads have given in. They've packed up. We've had bridges, not just, you know, some of the makeshift bridges, but actual really solid structures that have completely collapsed. And of course, it causes us to ask all sorts of questions.
Yes, you're right. We should be actually looking at the issues around the infrastructure and how do we proceed going forward, because when we talk about flooding, infrastructure get to be hit the most, and it affects all of us, and we are connected because of the infrastructure. But what is maybe important is also to start matching the infrastructure with the population, and this is where we are getting it wrong. The infrastructure that we have is not compatible with the number of the population that we have within our CBDs. And that is a problem on its own. If we are talking about a flat which a couple of years ago accommodated maybe 20 people, now we are talking about the same flat which accommodated about 50, 60 people, but the infrastructure and the number of toilets within that particular flat remains. And that put a lot of pressure on the infrastructure. So we need to start doing that audit. Our infrastructure that we have, through the infrastructure that we have at the moment, matching the population that we have, and if it's not, what needs to be done. That is part of the thing that we need to be looking at it. We also need to be starting to ask ourselves serious questions about the mushrooming of informal settlement and collection of solid waste that I spoke about earlier on. What do we do? What does that mean? The infrastructure within those settlements. To what extent is it responding to people's needs, but also to what extent is sustainable when we are dealing with flooding? Can they stand the test of the time? And also, we also need to look at the issues around how do we then make sure that we comply? It's not like a municipality does not have the compliance kind of requirement or criteria when you're building houses. Most of these houses, they are not even submitted to municipalities for vetting, even the plans. And even the foundation we're talking about has not been examined. Nobody knows what's going on in terms of the technical expertise needed. So those are some of the issues that we need to start following some of those basic instructions to make sure that actually we are like this. Of course, there are many other issues that we can talk about regarding the infrastructure, what needs to be done, but those are just my initial reactions.
Professor Mabhaudhi, let me come to you and talk about this issue of the response of disaster management teams to, again, these floods. The criticism now is that we've had, various other rounds of this kind of weather, and promises have been made, not only to develop early warning systems, but to have more coordinated responses when we have inclement weather of this nature, of course, take place. One cannot blame the government for not being able to predict that yesterday or over the last 24 hours we would have the kind of rainfall that we did. But certainly there is an expectation that when crisis does hit, there will be an immediate plan that can be activated. And certainly one doesn't get the sense of that looking at where we are when it comes to the scale of the response to this crisis.
Okay, thanks very much. I think sometimes we are harsh on government and we criticize government. But what we should be doing, in my opinion, is offering solutions to the government. The government of South Africa has so far been very progressive in terms of adopting best practice. South Africa, we've got what is called the National Framework for Climate Services for South Africa, which addresses the need for early warning systems. And we've got, that has been put in place. Importantly, there is a recognition, which you mentioned yourself, to develop early warning systems. But when we talk of an early warning system, it is in 4 parts recently, that make an early warning system. So the first part speaks to the data being available and being able to analyze and understand the risk. That has been done. The second part speaks to the issue of, your modeling and predictive capabilities, which is then being able to predict and forecast that there's going to be a situation. The third part, which is important, is the dissemination, being then able to disseminate the warning. And the last part, which I think you speak to in terms of the response of the disaster management, is the effective response capabilities. So what is currently not coming through are the last 2 parts of early warning, which is the dissemination and the effective response capabilities. So whilst the South African Weather Service did issue out the warning, as they did, but the question is, did the warning disseminate all the way through to people living within these flood-prone areas who would have been affected by the floods? Did they know about it? Secondly, if they were to know about it, do they have the capacity to respond? Do they know what to do if someone says there is a high risk of flooding? Do they know what it means when you say there is a level 5 orange warning? So we have to build capacities within disaster management. We have to build capacities at community level, because it is at the level of communities where the disaster is actually experienced, where the lived experience is, and where the impacts are measured. So when we talk of early warning systems, I think the emphasis should really be on developing community-based warning systems, building the capacity of people within communities to be able to respond to disaster, and also supporting the disaster management in terms of, building that capacity. There's a new form of capacity that we need to build within the disaster management services, which is focused more on preparedness rather than relief.
There's certainly so many lessons to take out of this moment, and, you know, at the same time, one thinks about the fact that what is needed right now more immediately is the response of rescue teams and disaster management officials on the ground, and one certainly hopes that these are conversations we'll continue to have on the long term, so that, you know, our cities are future-proof, that we don't end up continuously experiencing the same level of devastation as we are seeing unfold in KwaZulu-Natal.